Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Hello, welcome to Complex Creatures. My name is Jared Longbonds. As always, I'm here to talk about issues of spirituality, spiritual practices, and spiritual traditions to see how they may help us build a better world. With me today is a good friend of mine, Beau Underwood. Beau is the pastor of Allisonville Christian Church in Indianapolis. He is a PhD student. I'll let him say more about where he studies and what he's studying in a moment. But I like to think of Beau as one of those pastor scholars who is thinking deeply about his own tradition and how it sheds weight on the broader social context that we find ourselves in. He and a friend of his and a great writer, Brian Kaler, have recently published a book with Chalice Press called Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. I read this book. I found it very useful and insightful for the ongoing conversation that we're having today about the rise of Christian nationalism. For those of you who are not Christian, you probably have heard about Christian nationalism in the news, at least within the past couple years. There's this kind of style of church life or political engagement where people are really blending together nationalistic interest and faith. We've even seen the rise of the so-called MAGA church. I think I saw somewhere, this is not citable, but I think I saw somewhere that one of the fastest growing religions in America is called Christian nationalism. Well, whether that's true or not, I can say that how we think about our faith practices, our faith identity, and our national identity, and how they're coming together right now in this moment is pretty profound and important. So I'm happy to welcome my friend Beau. Beau, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, Jared. It's good to be here and having this conversation with you.
Awesome. And always is Alan. Alan, our producer, is here today from Knoxville. How are you doing, Alan? You doing okay?
I'm doing fantastic. It's fall break at the school where I teach, so I feel like I have insane amounts of time available.
Let's fill it up. Let's fill it up with tasks. How's your coffee?
There you go. That's it.
Okay, but Beau, tell us real quickly, where are you studying for your doctoral work right now, and what is it in particular?
Yeah, thanks. So I'd like to joke that I'm a very bad dinner companion because the only thing I know to talk about are religion and politics. So I have my pastoral side, and I've done, my MDiv and academic work in religion, but then I've also picked up a master's of public policy on the way, and I'm finishing a doctorate in public affairs at the University of Missouri, which is, encompasses public policy, public administration, those kind of things. And my dissertation will focus on the role of chaplains in government bureaucracy. So again, trying to connect those two worlds together in a way that really invites us to reflect on what is the role of religion in our society and what are the role of religious actors in our society.
Oh, that's great. So a lot of times in this podcast, we use that general word spirituality as opposed to religion because of the what I consider to be the privatization of something, a feeling of something more. But what I really want to talk about is any impulse that's religious or spiritual and take it out of the realm of the simply private to show how it can be a part of building a world that is more public and probably more virtuous. Today, we brought you in to talk about your new book, which, again, I said I read and I found it very useful. Let's talk for a little bit about Christian nationalism. If you could give us just an introductory primer here on what Christian nationalism is, how we're seeing it. If somebody wasn't I guess, if they weren't already oriented toward seeing it in the world, how might they know it when they saw it?
Yeah, great question. So, as you noted, this is a conversation that's really emerged in the last couple of years. It's not that Christian nationalism wasn't around before that. It's just we've gotten a lot more data on it, and we've had people studying it more. And so we really are becoming more aware of its presence and how it's functioning in our society. So two sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, in their sort of definitive book on the topic, Taking America Back for God, define it as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture. Making that a little bit more, basic, it's an attempt to sort of combine American identities and Christian identities in a way that advocates for a certain social order. So you think of this as anytime you're seeing somebody who says that to be a good American is to be a good Christian, or to be a good Christian means to be a good American, you're probably watching Christian nationalism.
So, in today's kind of milieu, we associate this with more of an evangelical to fundamentalist end of the spectrum of Christianity, probably more conservative right now. But that's not, and your book is suggesting that's not always been the case, right?
Yeah, so Philip Gorski, a sociologist at Yale, traces this all the way back to the Puritans, right, and demonstrates how it's been present from the very beginning of the United States. What our book does is shows how in the mid-20th century, the mainline Protestant tradition, the more moderate to progressive Christians, really did a lot of work that laid the sort of soil in which today's expressions of Christian nationalism have grown. And we want to suggest that as we're today blaming all the conservatives, blaming all the evangelicals, that is, as guilty as they might be in this moment, a lot of what they're drawing on are things that the mainline Protestant tradition did. A tradition that I love, right? But we need to be honest about our complicity in this. So when the pseudo-historians like David Bartons of the world go out there, they talk about America as a Christian nation, and they say, well, how do we know that that's true? And they'll point to things like under God, the Pledge of Allegiance, or in God we trust as a national motto, all things that are the result of mainline Protestants. And so there's a kind of waves of this stuff that goes around. We saw one wave in the mid-20th century that was really a mainline wave, and now we're seeing this current wave that I think is certainly more intense and perhaps more dangerous, but it's certainly not the only thing, the only way that it has existed out there.
So when we talk about Christian nationalism, what we're talking about in a lot of ways is at least in an American form, the question of how does the church or how does the Christian church relate to a state. And I mean, for Christian history, this goes back to the very foundation of our church in the world in the first century was that it was a small cult, right? That was at best tolerated, often persecuted. By the time of Constantine, Constantine makes it legal to be Christian. And then there's this, for many thinkers, myself included, an unhealthy or a worrisome blending of state interest and church interest to the point where there's a thing invented called Christendom, where we're not just talking about Christianity or Christianities, but this kind of political religious milieu that kind of blankets parts of the world. And then, this is obviously a very thick and thorough history, but you talk about it starting with American Puritanism. Like, how do you go back and study that for the background to your text? Like how Puritans envisioned America theologically as something that would in some sense infuse, this theological idea would be infused into the kind of the DNA of America. I'm not asking a very good question, but what are your thoughts on any of that?
No, I'm tracking. Yeah, so I do think Constantine, you could argue, was like the first Christian nationalist, right? I mean, I think that is a very significant moment when we're talking about the phenomenon we're talking about here. And then you think about how far that is from, the stories of the gospel, right? I mean, the Good Friday story is a story of the state, executing this person that we believe was the Messiah, right? So you would think that the natural Christian disposition would be a distrust of state power, a distrust of national identity because of what happened to Jesus. And if our lives are devoted to following him and we're trying to make our life look like his life, then all of a sudden, we would not be the ones to necessarily embrace, like, let's use the power of the state for our own purposes. But obviously we're coming a long ways from what happened on the cross. And, we don't do a ton of work all the way back to the Puritans. Again, Gorski kind of really covers that ground well. But I do think when you think about their understanding of America as a new Israel, when you understand some of the persecution that was going on in early colonial times, you really do see that there was this idea that, America or this new thing is God's instrument. It has both a political purpose and a religious purpose. There's a kind of a zealotry there that goes all the way back to the first European settlers arriving on North America, and part of what the motivation for them coming this way.
Well, it's just, I realized what you've written in the book. I read it, so I just didn't know how much just of your own study took you down those paths. I'm influenced a lot by a thinker named William Cavanaugh. Are you familiar with his work?
Absolutely, yeah, very much.
So William Cavanaugh, Migrations of the Holy. I like
it's a great book.
Yeah, it is. And I love the title of it. It's just the paradigm for thinking about, our secular age. People, my belief is that people aren't less religious today. They're just religious about other things, right? And so we migrate the holy around. And it's fascinating how holiness gets applied to nation states throughout the whole history. But it's fascinating how theology has had its imprint on that for America. Today, we're talking about issues of Israel and Palestine, what's going on in Gaza. I think your garden variety member of our society has no idea how much Christian eschatology has to do with that. And when the Puritans came to America, again, a lot of the thinking was driven by Christian eschatology. But unlike the eschatology of the 20th century, they believed that they were going to make a society get better and better and better to usher in the kingdom of God. And so there's that famous sermon given that America is the shining city on a hill, which would be repeated by, at least, if I'm not mistaken, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. At least both of our parties using a line that Jesus delivers about the hope for the church, but applying it to our nation state.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then if we want to get, farther down this path, right, we have this whole concept of civil religion. It starts with Robert Bella. It's this idea that there's sort of something sacred going on in the nation that is sort of vaguely religious, sort of universally spiritual, that belongs, it's a common sort of spiritual identity for all of us, but it's devoid of kind of particular sectarian meaning. And so that phrase in the shining city on the hill goes from words Jesus uttered, words that were then part of this particular Christian experiment in the early colonies, to this sort of vague notion of sort of what it means to be an American, is to be a participant in this project. So that phrase is kind of a great way of tracking how the use of Christian language has kind of morphed into something else in our society.
Yeah, I see that civil religion that Bella and you've written about in here. Like, I see it I see it dominating American sports, right? And what's interesting to me is when we sing, when we talk about, like, for instance, the death of a soldier, we say that they've given the greatest sacrifice for our freedom. It's very Christ-like language attributed to a soldier. And I'm not here to delegitimize the service of anyone who's served or died for causes that are associated with our country. But it's almost like you can't even ask the question of whether or not a cause was justified for a soldier's death, because it's the ultimate price for our freedom. It's like the tagline is ideologically there and cemented. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. So when, and it's longer ago now that we realize, but when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the Bishop Kirill, the Archbishop Kirill, or Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church,
right,
consecrated the war and called Russian men and soldiers to pick up arms and go fight, and talked about the fact that if they died, that sacrifice would be salvific, right?
Wow.
So again, from a Christian theology standpoint, I mean, people can say whatever they want. You could be a nationalist, but from a Christian standpoint, calling one's willingness to die for one's country salvific, assigning salvation to the nation state, is a pretty far afield from the Christian faith, right? I mean, and we don't think about this, we don't interrogate this as we try to live out our faith in public life, in the world today. It's really dangerous, I think, because what it does is it empties the gospel of meaning, and it makes people create a different gospel, right? A small g gospel, in a way that distorts the actual Christian faith and gets in the way of good discipleship. I mean, part of the argument of our book is not that you should be patriotic, you can be, but we have to put the nation state in its proper place if we're going to truly practice the Christian faith.
I really appreciate that, because I think that's the if I labor as a minister, and I do labor as a minister to kind of try to help people have their sense of pride for their country, or a sense of belief in some of its values, but at the same time try to show the distinction of what it means to be a Christian disciple, trying to help walk that that nice little pathway through that, what that looks like. That's a tough thing for me to help clarify for people, because we're dealing with feelings that are religious in nature. We're dealing with the most holy, iconic symbols, right? When we were in D.C. recently, and I was able to be with you in D.C., which is really lovely, my daughter, it was her first time, and we went to the monuments, and we went to go see Lincoln. And being an Illinois boy myself, absolutely enamored with Lincoln. And so it was a big deal to me to go see the monument. And we walked up there, and my daughter looks around for all of 2 minutes, and she comes back. She goes, "I don't think I like it." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she goes, "This is a shrine. This is like a temple, Dad. This is like a church." And she goes, and she's 12 years old. And she goes, "This reminds me of the Greek gods." And she and the funny thing is I was willing, and I've been pretty critical of the civil religion of our country and all that stuff in my theological development. I was able to kind of bracket that aside for the reverence of Lincoln for a moment. When my 12-year-old saw it for what it was, she goes, "This is somewhat a little bit beyond reverence and respect, or honoring and respectful. It's more reverent and worshipful," is what she said.
Yeah, I mean, I used to live in D.C. I visit the monuments. I like you, I'm sitting here going like, these are pretty awe-inspiring. And at the same time, what they're designed to do is instill a sense of devotion, right, to the nation state. Remember, you talked about sports too. We do a lot of things in sports that are designed to instill a sense of devotion and loyalty to a particular team. So these are definitely spiritual religious practices. And I don't think we often see them for what they are and recognize the influence they have over our loyalties, our resources, how we structure our lives.
For the sake of getting into more of the arguments of your book, and what I found really useful for my preaching and teaching in my context, is so we take this whole story of Christian nationalism, and we say, okay, what has the mainline world done to contribute to it? And you've already referenced several things, like the addition of certain clauses in our Pledge of Allegiance. You said the national motto, "In God We Trust," right? There's certain things. The National Prayer Breakfast, right? With right now, I mean, it's a hotly contested event now, right? I think in my lifetime, it was seen by the churches that I associated with as this is a great thing. Today, it's really questionable, because I guess whoever's judging the characters at it. But why don't you just walk us through some of these markers, these milestones, and how they came to be, where all of a sudden this kind of religious language was just doubled over on top of things that did not once have religious language, like our money and all that.
Yeah, so you had mentioned Lincoln, so I'll share the story. So the reason that "under God" is the Pledge of Allegiance is, you could argue, the fault of Abraham Lincoln. And what I mean by that, a little tongue-in-cheek, is that it wasn't in there originally, right? So the pledge is actually written by a Baptist pastor, right? So it is a Pledge of Allegiance for the nation written by a Baptist clergy person. The pledge doesn't have any reference to the divine in it. It doesn't say "under God" originally. There were some people really upset about this, that thought that the pledge should have some kind of theological reference, especially during the Cold War, where we were trying to contrast ourselves with, atheistic, communistic Russia. And there's a pastor at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which is where Abraham Lincoln went to church when he was president. The story, I don't know how true it was, but I was, he'd sit in the very back of the church and just kind of, work out his salvation with fear and trembling, because Lincoln was a very complicated spiritual guy.
Yeah.
And the pastor there, George Dockery, he was a really progressive guy, right? Marched with Martin Luther King Jr., was really active in the civil rights movement, protested the Vietnam War. At his time, I mean, he was a very progressive figure, but really believed that the pledge should have "under God" in it, and was a Christian nationalist in that way. And so he knows that it's the tradition for the American president to come to his church on Lincoln Sunday, the Sunday closest to Abraham Lincoln's birthday. So he knows that Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be in church on a Sunday. So he writes this sermon for an audience of one, and he preaches about how it's appalling that the Pledge of Allegiance doesn't have "under God" in it. And he even acknowledges in the sermon that he realizes that if we add this, that then an atheist won't be able to say the pledge. He doesn't think about anybody else, but he just says, well, an atheist then wouldn't be able to say it. But he's like, that's okay, right? Because an American atheist is a contradiction in terms, is what he says in his sermon. He calls him a spiritual parasite. I mean, he basically says, if you're an atheist, you're not a good American, right? He draws them outside the boundaries of American citizenship. So the sermon, gets all this attention of the president. There was all the media were there to hear it. They write stories about it. Pretty soon members of Congress are contacting the church. The mimeograph machines start going. And within a couple of weeks, the Pledge of Allegiance is changed to add the words under God by legislation. I mean, it's one of the most effective sermons in the history of American Christianity. You and I wish that our parents listened to our sermons that well. And remembered them, that following week, this guy's sermon changed the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah. When I was reading about that, I was thinking about taking a big swing from the pulpit.
Yeah.
That's the biggest swing.
But Jared, I think it's something else too, right? I don't know how long you preach. My sermons on a Sunday morning are 15 to 18 minutes roughly. So I get my members' attention for less than 20 minutes a week for them in the Christian faith. And yes, some of them come to Bible study, some of them go to Sunday school, some of them come to book club. We do other things, but for most of my members, the vast majority are hearing me 15 to 18 minutes once a week. And that's assuming they come to church every week. If we know schedules today that doesn't always happen. A lot of them are watching MSNBC or Fox News, a lot more during the week, right? Those stations are on 24/7. And they are forming people, they are discipling people, they are teaching people a different kind of faith in a particular party and certainly in the nation. And that influence is a lot stronger than my preaching on Sunday. And that's, I'm not blaming anybody for that. That's just the reality of this world we're living in. And I'm not even going into Facebook and TikTok, right? So the point is, when you think about what we're trying to do in the pulpit and what we're up against, it just makes it even more daunting.
Yeah, that there is the angle for Complex Creatures, this podcast there, of thinking about how our spirituality affects the public good, not just ourselves. I mean, by asking the question of what we are allowing to form our spiritual or our moral imaginations, we would be getting at the heart of something that most people don't think about. But like you say, the moral or spiritual imagination formed in a sermon, you just don't have the time and the pie graph of one's day to compete with 12 hours of listening to talk radio or watching the news or whatnot. And that calls to mind some of the work by James K. Smith about the liturgies of the world that form us. Just the practices. Some are surrounding the nation state, some are surrounding consumerism, some are surrounding sporting events, right? The liturgies that just we don't even realize that we're in, that are forming us, the practices, the things we hear that are just forming the way we imagine the good life in the world. So for the Christian, being a disciple today really requires us to be self-critical and interrogate what is forming us, to ask that question.
And that's what I think a lot of what we're trying to call attention to in the book is that for the longest time, mainline Protestants and other Christians really thought that this sort of, religious patriotism just easily went well together, right? There wasn't a lot of interrogation of it. From God and country, the motto of the Boy Scouts, it was just, there's no conflict here at all, which there always was a conflict, right? But we just didn't pay attention to it because the mainliners had control of the culture, or we were in a more homogenous society. There's lots of reasons why this sort of went so long without being heavily criticized. And I'm a patriot, right? Like, I love the United States. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I'm really grateful for all the advantages that being a citizen of this country affords. And I'm great with I'm great with the 4th of July. Like, I like fireworks, right? Just don't light them off in the sanctuary, right? Not only is it bad theology, but your insurance company doesn't want you to do that either. And I do think what Christian nationalism does is so dangerous is it makes the nation into an idol, right? It makes the nation beyond critique. And if you can't critique the nation, right, if you turn the nation into a god, then it means that every time we veer off, every time we fall short of our ideals, it's not going to be easier or obvious for us to spot it. It's going to reduce the ability of the church and Christians to offer a sort of conscientious witness or to be the conscience of the nation. I'll remember like after 9/11, right? In my little hometown, rural Illinois, there was a big billboard that said, "America, love it or leave it." And I just thought, oh, what a theological statement, right? Like you either love the country by not critiquing it, or if you critique it, then it means you're not loving it and you should get out. I just don't think that's healthy patriotism, right? I think the most to be patriotic is to want the nation to live up to its ideals. And the Christian faith gives us some resources, not only to live well as Christians, but also to live well as Americans, mostly by helping us make sure we don't turn the country into an idol.
What's interesting, and this is just anecdotal, my own perspective, is that I feel like I'm pastoring and thinking as a Christian in an era when to ask people to blindly follow the church or to blindly endorse the church without critique, that's anathema. We cannot ask for that. In fact, right. We have to be critical. We have to be self-critical. We have to repent. And by the way, I'm not against that. But the call is for greater authenticity, for better, for worse of people's understanding of what that would really mean, greater authenticity all the time. However, I do think you're right. Christian nationalism has created this whole, to me, it's a golem, it's a monster, this edifice, this thing that you can't critique. So it's interesting that in this milieu, the church is now something that is supposed to be under critique all the time and correction and all that. But the nation state itself, or however you conceive of it, is the thing that you could be fideist about or just the blind faith about. You just have to support it because you're not allowed to critique it. If you critique it, like you said, you don't love it, which is not, I mean, that's ridiculous. My wife loves me, yet she critiques me whenever she needs to.
Yeah, no, exactly. I noticed this really strongly around the conversation we had a couple years ago around critical race theory, right? Where it was all of a sudden this idea that we would acknowledge that the history of racism in our society had sort of lasting effects in systematic ways was somehow to be disparaging of America. And I was sitting here looking at this and going like, isn't this just repentance, right? From a Christian standpoint, isn't this idea of acknowledging sin, understanding its effect on us, and committing to do better in the future? I mean, this is a basic Christian practice. And you're right. Now, the church is being called in some ways to repent, to confess and repent of its past sins, which I think is a healthy practice. And yet we aren't willing to do the same thing when it comes to our citizenship. That just strikes me as very odd. Like, why are we so afraid to name where America has fallen short and call America to do better? It seems like Christians should be the ones being able to lead the way in doing that, and sort of helping our culture do that better. And instead, we're becoming the ones, or there's a group of Christians that are becoming the ones that are sort of saying, no, America is an idol. America deserves our ultimate loyalty, and we don't dare critique this thing. It's very scary to me.
I had a conversation with somebody who really wanted to get at what I believed. This is years ago, and they said, "But you do agree America is the greatest country in the world?" And they kept saying that to me, and my intellectual honesty made me stop because I'm like, I haven't been to every country. I don't, and I'm like, but. It really made me go, what? Well, why is that the ideology in your head? Like what you said a moment ago, that you wouldn't prefer to be born anywhere else. You're very pleased that you were born here. You feel blessed to be born here. I feel all those ways. I actually feel very patriotic. In fact, I don't fly an American flag often because of my patriotism, because I actually don't think I would commit, I think I would commit flag etiquette issues, and I'm not going to do it. And so like, I got a certain respect. It's over here. At the very same time, like I'm in a world where people want me to hold on to these kind of faith ideas, like America's the greatest country in the world. I think that I have a lot of advantages. I think there's a lot of great things about our country. I think there's a genius to it. But once I start, as you say, critiquing, then I get turned off, right?
Yeah. So one of the big debates in Christian nationalism, right, is the role of the flag, right? It's particularly the role of the flag in worship. Does it belong in the sanctuary? And honestly, the best response I've ever heard to this has really shaped my thinking was actually by a more conservative mainline pastor who said, I think of the sanctuary as an embassy of heaven. And that really resonated with me because I used to live in D.C., right? You walk down Massachusetts Avenue, there's Embassy Row, and you see all these ornate buildings flying the flags of their country, and they're there to do their country's bidding in the American capital. And so, I used to walk by the Australian embassy, and there's a fence around it. You don't go on it unless you have a reason for being there, because it's not that it's sovereign territory, but basically it's outside of sort of American authority unless there's, something really crazy going on. And they fly the Australian flag. It would be really strange if you walked by the Australian capital or embassy and saw the U.S. flag flying there, because they're not doing the work of the United States there. They're doing the work of Australia there. And if you think about what we're doing in our sanctuaries, right, we are worshiping the Lord of all the nations, right? If our sanctuaries are outposts of heaven, if they're embassies of heaven, then no nationalistic symbol, the American flag, the Brazilian flag, the Australian flag, no nationalistic symbol belongs in that sanctuary. It just violates the fundamental purpose of what the sanctuary is for. And I think if we talk about it that way, it's a little bit more positive. It helps people realize what's going on and reflect on what's happening. Too many pastors have been fired for just going in and taking the flag out of the sanctuary. They have the right theology, but they don't go about it the right way, and it gets them in trouble. But I think we need to be having conversations about this stuff. And what are we doing when we worship? What is the sanctuary for? And we need to lead with that versus, well, we have to have a flag in there because we're trying to be good Americans.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. Thank you for that story. The interesting thing about our tradition, and for those listeners out there, Beau and I are ministers in the same denomination and same tradition, and our tradition is complicated like everyone. But the aspect of our tradition, the Church of Christ, Beau, you would never see.
Jared, we're the one true church.
Bring another idol in the mix. So the Church of Christ aspect of our tradition, you would never see flags. And if you read some of our earliest thinkers, they were totally against it. But in a lot of our disciples, the churches that we serve, which is a mainline denomination, you see flags. And I actually had it removed from our sanctuary, and a former minister on our staff called me up and said, hey, here's the reason why it's there. And so I want to bring that right back around to your book about how mainline Protestant helped build Christian nationalism. Can you talk about a few other ways besides the Presbyterian sermon that affected Eisenhower? Because a lot of this happened during the time of Eisenhower, right?
Yeah.
That was in the post-war era. Can you give us a little light about this prayer breakfast? And the reason why I want you to talk about it is because I've seen several documentaries about it in the past couple of years. People are questioning the power brokers in the room, and it's got a lot of attention. What about the National Prayer Breakfast in Christian nationalism? What can you speak? Can you shed some light for us on that?
Yeah, and I'll touch there for a minute, and I'd love to also talk about the role of the Bible and all of this, right? Yeah. Because I think that really speaks to it. I mean, the prayer breakfast, like you said, is such a complicated thing. There's a reason we devote a whole chapter to it, is because it's this event that is really meant to basically help Christians become power brokers in D.C. and wield the kind of influence that, on one read, Jesus would just fight anathema. And then it's morphed into this thing where, there's some really questionable people in the room that are gathering with the nation's leaders under the guidance of prayer. And you're also, essentially using the Christian faith to advance national interests, not just America's national interests, but the national interests of other countries. And the more you think about it, the more troubling it really is. And yeah, it was, it's become more of an evangelical event in its identity, but it's really was something that got started by mainline leadership. But let me just speak for my favorite story in the whole book is this role about the Bible, right? And partly because it's one of the few times I've been, able to predict the future. We published the book earlier this year. Of course, we wrote it before that, as we sent it to the publisher. And we open this one chapter that says, imagine this, right? Imagine that Paula White Cain and several other of Trump's evangelical advisors had gathered with him in the Oval Office during his presidency and presented with him a new God and country Bible. And then he went out to the Rose Garden and held a big press conference to talk about how important this Bible was and how all Americans should read it and how it was just critical to his administration's agenda. And I would have gone absolutely, I would have been outraged. I suspect a lot of people would have got on Facebook and just been screaming at the world. And it would have been, because we would have found it obscene. And then it happened, right? Then former President Trump got paid money to endorse the Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA Bible. And a lot of us got really angry on Facebook and screamed about it, how awful and obscene it was. But what we didn't realize is that the first person to do this was the mainline church. So when the Revised Standard Version of the Bible comes out, right, the version of the Bible that was produced by the National Council of Churches, they take the very first copy of it, fresh off the printing press, and they walk it down to the White House, and they present it to Harry Truman in 1952. And Truman goes out and holds a Rose Garden ceremony to promote the Bible. And he talks about how important this book is, and if you could just slip it under the Iron Curtain, it would, help create the peace that his administration is trying to foster around the world. So what Trump did as a former president, which certainly I found gross and obscene, that he was making money off of hawking a Bible he probably hasn't ever read, a Bible that had the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in it alongside, Exodus and Matthew. As gross as that was, the mainline Protestants did it with a sitting president in the White House, and with all the official trappings of political power around it. And both of these episodes caused me to think about, once we recognize the one happening in the 50s that most mainliners don't understand or know about, why do we care, right? Why do we care what version of the Bible the president reads? Why do we care if the president reads the Bible at all? Why does how the president, uses the Bible matter at all to me as a pastor, as a Christian? I would get if somebody came to you, Jared, at Peachtree and said, Pastor, what version of the Bible should I buy? I need a new Bible, right? Or what version of the Bible should I give my grandson? That makes total sense to me. We are a spiritual authority for them. We have this kind of relationship. Why we care what version of the Bible Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Harry Truman reads doesn't make any sense to me. And yet, obviously, it matters quite a bit because we keep looking to the presidents to legitimize our new versions of the Bible. It's really odd.
I really appreciate you bringing these things up, and that's one thing I like about the book so much, is that you're not, excuse me, you are not looking for easy knockdown villains for your narrative. You're showing how that we as a people, mainline to evangelicals, liberal to conservative, we as a people keep doing this. We keep blending the message of the scriptures, Jesus Christ, with our national identity in some troubling ways. So let's just, for the sake of it, so kind of maybe bullet point quickly, what are some real dangers to people of faith or to any of us about Christian nationalism? What are the dangers? And one of them I think you've hit on is that it makes the nation hard to critique. And we should be able, as people of faith or no faith, we should be able to critique it.
Yeah, so I think that, there's sort of a couple theological dangers, and then there's a couple of small d democratic dangers, right? So on the theological side, we talked about the way that Christian nationalism fosters idolatry. So it distorts our relationship to God by giving our ultimate loyalty to things that aren't God. And the other thing I think it does is it diminishes the created equality of people, right? So if we believe that, all of us bear the image of God, right? And we understand that Christian nationalism tries to make some people more and some people less based upon the way they believe, the country they belong to. It really, disparages the image of God that exists in every created person. So I think there's some real theological danger to the sort of doctrine it tries to promote. And then the small d democratic side, right? We live in a democracy where everybody's supposed to have an equal voice. Everybody's supposed to have an equal say. Not everybody wins all the time, but everybody gets to sort of have influence over what happens. And Christian nationalism tries to say that, no, certain voices are privileged over others in society, right? Those voices are Christian. Those voices are white. Those voices are male. Those voices get to have more of a say than others because they're the ideal American. And that, of course, is dangerous to democracy. And at the extreme, right, Christian nationalism is used to justify violence. So it basically says in order to protect this order the way God intends things, if we have to use violence as a means to do that, so be it. We saw some of this on January 6th, 2021, but it's not the only example of that. So I think that's one of the things that makes it really dangerous. And then people will say, Jerry, I think this is a really important point. Like, people will say, well, isn't this just a label you're applying to people you disagree with? And it's like, no. To be clear, this is something that social scientists study, right? So we know we can measure Christian nationalism, right? We can measure the degree of which people support this ideology. And to be clear, it's not binary. It's not you're either a Christian nationalist or you're not. They study this on a scale. They ask you a bunch of questions, and all of us register somewhere on that scale. Hopefully less rather than more. But then we can also study the way that your support of Christian nationalism or belief in Christian nationalism correlates with other things. So we know, for example, that the people who score the strongest on the Christian nationalism scale, the people that embrace these ideas the most of America as a Christian nation, are the ones that are least likely to support interracial marriage, right? We know that the people who are the most likely to support Christian nationalism are the people who are most likely to support restriction on voting rights. So when we talk about Christian nationalists wanting to regard some people as less, like it's there's data that demonstrates this. We're not disparaging people. We're not casting aspersions. We're just looking at what the statistics tell us and then saying, whoa, there's a problem here.
That's great. I mean, when I say it's great, I mean, it's just great information. It's not great reality. And I love the fact that you're illuminating for us that there's a spectrum and that they can actually test and find where you are in the spectrum. I mean, you're not pushing for some sort of pure idealism here. You're asking for us to be aware and to think about where where ideas come from, and to think about what we're devoted to. And I think that is important for us, because even the best intended amongst us can have some unintentional aspects to our worldview, some unconscious things filter in. One of the things that I think about when I think about what the church should be is, and maybe it's just idealism, but before the time of Constantine, at least, the church was far more countercultural. And over time with Christendom and everything, it became the dominant thing. And as we call the phrase, mainline, Protestants mainline culture, the church really was just like lockstep with American society. And then it's sort of now a subculture, which it sort of now seems to be walking with culture, but in a just kind of a subgroup. And I feel like when we look at the scriptures, if we're trying to follow the way of Jesus, what we're seeing is a countercultural movement. And so I just, as a pastor, try to help people understand that just because the world says it's so, or just because that's what everyone's doing at a parade route, doesn't mean we have to. How is it that our following of Christ makes us live completely counter to the world? And I think Christian nationalism muddies that call, if that's a faithful call or not, and that'll let others decide that. But that's one thing I think it's important.
No, I completely agree. I mean, obviously, like many, I'm lamenting the sort of trends of secularization in our culture. We're having fewer people participate in Christian community. Those who are participating in it are participating less. And the sort of influence of faith in people's lives seems to be in a moment of waning. But I also think there's an opportunity here, right? Because as I talked about my church, those of you who show up every Sunday want to be here. You're not coming because it's socially advantageous. You're not coming to be seen, and be sort of noticed. You're coming because you really believe this stuff. You believe in the power of this community. You want to be formed in the faith. You're wanting to follow Jesus in the world. And so the neat thing about recognizing the problem of Christian nationalism is once we give up the idea that Christians need to seize the power of government to enforce our ways, it actually liberates us to actually be the kind of Christian communities we want, we're called to be. It allows us to, I think, get closer to Jesus as how he and the early Christian movement was in the imperial society, sort of right before, during his public ministry, then right after his death and resurrection. So I actually think that there's, if we can sort of purge ourselves of these idolatrous ideas, it helps refine us into better Christians. I mean, the goal of the book is not to make people mad. It's not to like hate on America or hate on Christians. It's to help us become better Christians, and I do think derivatively better Americans, because again, we put the nation in its proper place.
No, I think you effectively do that. I mean, I found it like incredibly useful and hopeful. It taught me some things that opened my eyes, and I don't think it made me mad, but I think it was more hopeful. I think you did a great job with it. Let me ask you, are there any spiritual practices or disciplines that you practice that maybe help you in the world of sorting through the world of Christian nationalism and trying to follow the kingdom of God? Are there things that you do to kind of help you see a way through all this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you might laugh because it's going to surprise you when I talk about, right? So first off, I pray for our leaders, right? Because I don't pray that our leaders would be good Christians. I pray that our leaders would be wise and would help the flourishing of God's people. I do that because Scripture calls us to do that, right? I'm also very clear about what my ultimate devotion is to, and I try to cultivate ways in which, the phrase Jesus is Lord really matters to me. if Jesus is the ultimate authority in my life, that should impact not just, how I relate to the nation, but how I spend my money, how my family is structured. So I'm trying to be really intentional about that being a confessional statement. We know early on, of course, Jesus as Lord was a challenge to the idea that Caesar is Lord. And so what are the modern Caesars that we need to resist because too many people are calling them Lord? So those are a couple of things that I try to do to take really seriously this idea that I am confessing a certain claim that I'm willing to be obligated to or dutiful towards. And that means that other things don't get that loyalty from me.
Praying for the leaders I find to be a challenging thing.
Very.
Because you're going to pray for people that you really disagree with. And to truly try to enter in prayer for somebody that you even see as an enemy, which in terms of political leadership, that's how we think, even if we don't want to. It's hard not to. And so praying for them is an act of humility. And I think that if we did more of that, it could expand our moral imagination just on a daily basis. Let me ask a question that you may not be expecting, but we have recently in our talks, and Alan's been quiet over there. That's cool, Alan, but if you have anything, I'll let you chime in a second. Alan, the last couple of times we've gotten together, we've talked about some recommendations. Beau, do you have any good recommendations in terms of books that it could be on any topic, things that you're finding helpful, podcasts, documentaries, any recommendations, this or any other topic?
Yeah, so one book that has really caught my attention, so I've studied religion and politics, now for 15 years, maybe 20, if I acknowledge how old I'm getting. And so it's rare that something captures my attention. It's like, oh, I haven't thought about something this way before. Oftentimes I get, new nuances, but something that really challenges my thinking. And there's a great little book out by a theologian named Ross Kane. He's Episcopalian, teaches at Virginia Theological Seminary, called The Good News of Church Politics.
Okay.
And what I loved about this book is it's written for churches, or I guess written to be used, is that he basically says, and I just kind of sense a variation of this, like politics is always going to be there, right? Politics is simply how we decide how to live together. So there's politics in our homes, there's politics in our churches, and of course there's politics in the country. Anytime we're making a decision about how we're going to live together, that's politics. So the question then is, how should the church practice politics? And he really sort of begins with this idea that the place that church politics should begin is, how do we love our neighbors? And he tries to extrapolate from that a whole sort of ethic of politics in the church and our society. And I think it's just super well done. So to give you two examples that are my favorite, he talks about how politics and prayer are often parallels. We think often of prayer as, quietist, let's go over here and pray. It doesn't have anything to do with politics. But what he's saying is both of these are practices of persistence with the goal of achieving a world that we hope for that doesn't yet exist, right? So when I'm praying, I'm asking for something to be that doesn't yet exist. When I'm doing politics, I'm working for something to be that doesn't yet exist. And so there's a real parallel there, and these things kind of reinforce each other rather than being at odds with each other.
Both are practices of hope.
They are absolutely, and both are necessary, right? We need prayer to recharge us in order to do the work of social witness in the world. And then the other thing he talks about that I love, going back to what you were just saying, Jared, is praying for our enemies. He does this whole chapter on this. I think is really powerful. But one of the things he does just for a minute is he flips the script, right? He says, and we also need to take seriously what it means to be somebody's enemy, right? So there are people out there in the world, hopefully not many of them, who would call me their enemy for one reason or another, right? Somewhere along the way, we got crossways. We don't believe the same things. We're working for different purposes. But to them, I'm the enemy. And what do I want them to do, right? I don't want them to be plotting my demise. I don't want them to try to be vengeful. I want them to pray for me. I want them to maybe try to convince me of my wrongdoing. I want them to engage me when we're disagreeing ethically. I want them to be a good enemy towards me. And I want to be a good enemy towards them. And I don't think we think about this, right? What is the ethic of being an enemy from a Christian standpoint? It's to pray for them. It's to wish the best for them. It's even where we think they're wrong, to listen to them and understand them, and not necessarily to change our minds, but at least to give them the hearing so that we can know where they're coming from and know how to disagree with them more honestly. I think this is something that we don't think about in the church. So yes, we are praying for our enemies, but our enemies are hopefully also praying for us, and we should be thinking about there are people out there that call us the enemy. So The Good News of Church Politics by Ross Kane, it's Kane, is a really fantastic resource right now.
Thank you for that. Any other recommendations?
Most of my other work is focused on the doctoral stuff, so it's just really boring things about, research methods and chaplains and government bureaucrats. So I won't bore you all with the rest of that.
That's fine. Alan, do you have any questions or comments? You've been quiet today, Professor. Anything you have?
Yeah, I've been quiet because I wanted to make sure I wasn't interrupting the actual theological thinkers in the room. The one thing that I'll say that I do as a practice is I'm big on the idea that I want to be able to articulate the thoughts of people that I disagree with in a way that they would agree that I am reflecting their idea. So in other words, I have a couple relatives who are like we all do, who have completely contrary opinions to the way that I think about the kinds of topics we're talking about today. And one thing that I feel really, really strongly about is that I should be able to discuss with them what they are trying to articulate to me in a way that they would agree that I was saying it the way that they would agree with, before I can get to the point where I can talk to them about what I disagree in their idea. And I think that respect keeps me from generalizing or turning anything into a straw man or whatever.
Yeah, Al, I think that if I could just say, Jared, I think that is not only so valuable, but it's a lesson that I remember learning, right? So I remember showing up to a Reformation theology class in college and being so ready to just take Zwingli apart, right? To just say all the things I didn't disagree with Zwingli on. And my professor, 2 minutes into my rant says, wait a minute, Beau, before you can disagree with Zwingli, you first have to be able to articulate what Zwingli says in a way that, he would have understood it. And I was like, oh, that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to understand these texts for what they are first before we just, engage critically with them. And I'll always remember learning that lesson. And you're right, we caricature people, we don't understand them, and it gets in the way of relationship and community.
Beau, that's perhaps the most nerdy thing that you've said in this whole thing. You want to take Zwingli apart. Are you familiar with the after party curriculum, Beau?
No, tell me about this.
I just found out about it yesterday. I listened to No Small Endeavor, what Lee Camp's podcast.
I do too.
He had Russell Moore and David French on yesterday.
It's sitting in my feed to be listened to. I just haven't gotten there yet.
Fantastic episode. And they have a curriculum they've written called The After Party. And apparently I happened to just be at a luncheon at a church down the street yesterday for Midtown Atlanta clergy. And someone said they just went through it with several small groups because it is, our election season. We're recording this, folks, a week or so before Halloween. So we're gonna either have a Kamala Harris or a President Trump here in the next couple of weeks. And they said it's very helpful. And one of the things that French and Moore are trying to do is help people articulate and think through the thoughts of disagreeing, to have disagreements with people without finding the other person as a demon to them, disagreement without, right. But the other thing that kept talking about was how it's amazing how when you really talk to people and listen, as Alan has articulated, is that you find you have the same values as a lot of people that you disagree with. They may have different policy or different ideas on the policy. But if you can understand, if you can even understand the same values or something that there's a bridge that can be merged in some of this. So what they're really trying to get at is separating people from their voting, and it's interesting. So give that a listen. Offline, you and I should talk about it. See what
I would love that. Yeah, I would. I met Russell Moore when I first worked out in D.C., and I was working at Sojourners, and we collaborated on some things. We disagreed on some things when he was leading the ERLC. But again, a healthy respect for who he was and just a type of Christian political engagement that seems to me that should be obvious that it now feels archaic, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the kind of work that David French does with him as well. It's amazing to me because I don't always agree with David French, but he's been in trouble with his quote unquote tribe for, just being self-critical of his own tribe. Right. So amazing to see that this is where we're at today. But anyway, listen, Beau, we really, really appreciate your time. You guys, you can catch Beau's sermons at Allisonville Christian Church. Just Google search that. you can get his book with Brian Kaler, really well done, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. It's on Amazon, but I'm sure that they want you to go to Chalice Press and buy it from there. I'm sure that's what Brad Lyons would want, right?
They do, chalicepress.com, and if you use the code, the coupon code BA for Baptizing America, BA podcast, it'll get you a third off the cover price. It'll actually be the cheapest place you can buy it as well.
Oh, wonderful. All right, my friend. I appreciate all that you do. I appreciate your partnership and the ministry that we do together. And thank you for your time. God bless you.
Thanks for having me on, friends.